there's been a result in the election in Georgia. I've covered this election, and I've been astonished that not as many people cared about this election. Stacey Abrams in Georgia, again, somebody who ran as a flaming lefty in a deep red state and had remarkable results running that way in that deep red state. And were it not for the voter suppression and the kicking people off the voter rolls and the slow rolling, the allowing people to register for voting, there might have been a different result. But not so much. Stacey Abrams didn't concede in as much she acknowledged that she wasn't going to win. And I know that's a distinction, but and maybe you could say it's a distinction that doesn't matter, seeing as she's not going to be governor. But still, it's an interesting one nonetheless. Mrs. Abrams, while acknowledging Friday that she could not win, did not concede either. More than 200 years into Georgia's democratic experiment, the state failed its voters, Mrs. Abrams said, her voice alternating among anguish, contempt, frustration, and outrage as she argued that 8 years of systemic disenfranchisement, disinvestment, and incompetence had its desired effect on the electoral process in Georgia. Agreed. Still, it was the closest race for Georgia since 1966. Mrs. Abrams came within 18,000 votes of a runoff and 55,000 votes of winning outright in an election that drew almost 4 million ballots. Let's be clear, this is not a speech of concession, because concession means acknowledging an action is right, true, and proper, Mrs. Abrams said amid a blistering attack on Mr. Kemp's record as state's chief elections regulator and on the balloting process in Georgia. As a woman of conscience and faith, I cannot concede that. Mrs. Abrams ended her campaign. She returned to the theme that surfaced throughout, that Mr. Kemp, who was Georgia's Secretary of State until Thursday after the election, meaning he was head of the election while running in the election, had used his position to suppress the voting and ease his path to the governor's mansion. Although she pledged to pray for Mr. Kemp, she also uncorked a bracing indictment on his tenure as Secretary of State, including the election last week. Georgia citizens tried to exercise their constitutional rights and were still denied the ability to elect their leader, she said. Under watch of the now former Secretary of State, democracy failed Georgians of every political party, every race, every region, again. Mr. Kemp, who has defended his time as Secretary of State and rebuffed Democratic attacks that he is an architect of suppression, did not respond directly to Mrs. Abrams' critiques on Friday. From his standpoint, the election is done. From her standpoint, this election wasn't necessarily a fair arbitration of what Georgians wanted. I've shown you before, these guys have gotten rid of hundreds of thousands of people off the voting rolls. And they did this in order to make it much more difficult for Georgians to go to the polls and exercise their right to vote, particularly people who were not going to vote Republican. Mrs. Abrams is right. And she was right not to concede and to fight on in this election. I give her all the props in the world for doing so. So, I'll end it here. Mrs. Abrams ends her campaign, but refuses to concede. Thanks all. Have a good one.